everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Haley, and I'm the Hope for HIE social worker. And this is our panel support group about feeding tubes and HIE. So we have three awesome panelists here who are part of our peer support mentor program and are also parents to HIE children. We have Hope, Allison, and Kat. So I'll give them a second just to introduce themselves before we get started.
Hi, I'm Hope. My son is Logan, and he is 3.5. He has severe HIE, CP, epilepsy, all the things.
Hi, I'm Allison. My son is Rob. He is 6. He is also on the severe end of the spectrum, and he got his feeding tube at 14 months old.
And I'm Kat. My son is August. He would be 5. He passed when he was 2. He was also severely affected from HIE, and he got his feeding tube at 3 weeks old.
Thank you all so much for sharing. We're excited to hear all your expertise. So on this panel discussion, there's a lot of talk in our support groups and our Facebook groups about feeding tubes and a lot of different topics. So we're trying to every single month kind of talk about a different topic. So this group will be about feeding tubes and how they relate to HIE and just some information that everyone on the panel, kind of wished they had known or they feel is helpful information that would have helped them with their journey with their child's feeding tube. So for the purposes of our discussion, we won't go into a lot of the medical information about feeding tubes, but we'll just share that there are two main types of tubes. There's the G tube or the gastrostomy tube, and then the J tube, which is the jejunostomy tube. And some people have one or both. And mainly in this discussion today, we're going to talk about like G tubes because they are like the most common. And the panelists can kind of share about how that relates to their child and how they made their decision with their tube for their child. And a lot of the discussion we have in the groups is just that's a big decision and kind of how you navigate making that decision. And so our panelists are just going to share a little bit about, that it's common to be fearful of a G tube or a feeding tube, but there are many positives. So if y'all want to just take turns and share.
So I love Rob's feeding tube. I say it all the time. It was the best decision we ever made for him. He is now solely fed by his feeding tube, but he also still takes purees by mouth for pleasure. Like we'll do like whipped cream at the holidays or pudding for special occasions. So it still allows him to enjoy the world around him, but get the nutrition he needs.
Logan got his G tube last year when he was 2.5, and I had actually avoided a G tube for a really long time, just because I was not scared of it, but I didn't want to feel like he failed, which he didn't. But that's just kind of something that was put into my brain early on, which happens a lot. But since he got it, we got it with the intention of it being just for supplementation and hydration, but actually ended up he's solely G-tube fed now, which is perfect. It works for him. There's no more stress. He's very severely orally averse. So it takes away a lot of stress on me and him to keep him fed, hydrated, and just, enjoying life, not having to stress about eating. He's also on a ketogenic diet for his epilepsy now, which the G-tube makes it 1,000 times easier for that as well. So definitely don't regret it at all. It's actually like one of my favorite things.
I loved August's G-tube. It made things easier. He aspirated a lot, so it would really help in comfort for myself to know that he wasn't getting that liquid. He would even aspirate his own spit into his lungs, which was a risk for pneumonia. He never ate by mouth, so it wasn't like an adjustment period for me, but just the comfort of knowing that he wasn't at risk for aspirating was just so comforting. And then taking meds when he needed to take medication, it made it so much easier instead of having to fight to get him to take them.
And I know he had talked a little bit about just does anyone want to elaborate on kind of how the tube kind of takes like how it's helpful when they're sick, kind of like Kat was talking about with medication, or when you're out and about with your child, or when you're, traveling, or different things like that, like how you facilitate the tube feedings and kind of how it helps, and what things you found that, it makes a difference in.
Oh, I know for when Rob's sick, we are able to still keep him hydrated through the G tube, even if he is like, having any like vomiting or anything like that, we can run like Pedialyte or water, whatever we need to run, like an ounce an hour or even slower if we need to. So rather than having to go to the hospital to get an IV because he won't eat, we're able to still maintain his hydration and stay home for at least a little bit longer than we would be able to before.
For sure. We do the same thing. It's really nice, like, because when he was bottle fed, when he was sick, he didn't want to eat, which, that's normal. But we would always end up in the hospital and he would just need fluids. And not having to do that every time now is really nice. And then also, like you mentioned, traveling, we're on the go a lot, like a lot of families are with therapy, school, all those kinds of things. And so the G Tube allows us to have a little bit more flexibility with feeding because when he was bottle fed, he was very particular. He did not like to really take a bottle outside of the house or only would take it from me. So it made it pretty hard to like schedule feedings and make sure he wasn't too hungry or, any of that. And then, so his G tube, I can just hook it up, drive to therapy. He's done by the time we get there, go in, do his therapy, do some like push some water for him in between feeds. Uh, it's nice to know that he's always hydrated because I don't have to like before he got his G tube, I was tracking every ounce that he would take. And it was getting really stressful as the number was getting lower and lower and lower. And then we travel very far for our neurology care. And our trips used to take us like 2 to 3 hours extra because of just having to sit in a gas station parking lot trying to convince him to take his bottle. But now we can stop, stretch a little bit, and then get back on the road, and he can just eat in his car seat, and it's zero stress. So that's been nice.
So for me, when I was pregnant, I was, told all the time, like, you can't feed them while you're driving, or you can't feed them while they're in their car seat. It's not safe because if they choke, it can cause problems. And so with the feeding tube, and I don't drive. I still don't drive. But I took the bus a lot. So it made it a lot easier for travel, whether I was in a car or whether I was on the bus. Then I wasn't trying to get the bottle in his mouth. And then I, again, didn't have to worry about him choking.
With traveling too, I know like we personally use a feeding tube backpack, like an adapted backpack with a mommy hook and hang it from the headrest or his chair or wherever. Some people use like a flying squirrel hook, or there's all different ways. Some people just use the syringe to feed while they're out. There's so many different options of how you feed in with the G tube.
Thank y'all for sharing. Now, I know we talked a little bit about in our meetings just that, a feeding tube is not always a permanent, but it's okay that it is. And then we also talked about using it for supplementation. And like, I know Allison, you talked about pleasure feeds or small feeds. So does anyone want to talk a little bit more just kind of about that process?
So with August, when he started teething, there wasn't a lot that we could do. He had oral aversions and he wouldn't take any like teething toys or anything like that. So what I would do is I would get some ice cream on my finger and I would just rub it on his gums, and that made it a lot easier. The cool and then the flavor made him, more, he liked to taste the flavor of the icing more than anything else. So ice cream was a big one for us. And then I started doing it for holidays. It wasn't much either. It was just enough to like get a taste.
So with Rob, well, he'll probably always have his G2, but there are lots of kids who will get it, like especially in the NICU, and then as they develop and get older and stronger and develop their skills better, that they could have it taken out. Some kids have it for just extra water because they're not taking enough in, like how Hope said before that how it was the original purpose. But I mean, I swear our kids with feeding tubes are the most hydrated kids around. We all, they definitely drink way more water than I do every day. um, but or some people will use it because they're not taking enough calories in. So there's so many different options, and it doesn't have to be a forever thing, doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. It's really an individualized journey, just like everything else we do.
Yeah, it's really flexible. Like for Logan, like I said, it originally was going to be just for supplement and hydration, because at the time he was on a seizure medication that caused him to kind of lose his appetite. But then through that, and then he was also fighting taking his medication. And when you have a kid with epilepsy, generally there's more than one medication, and then depending on other factors in their life, it's a lot. So he was on like 4 medications, was refusing to take them, choking, spitting it out. So he wasn't getting his full dose, or he was choking, which caused him to aspirate, get pneumonia. And then finally, the last time he got aspiration pneumonia, we decided to put an NG tube in, because he needed to be healthy to get the G tube surgery. And continuously choking or spitting out that medication was only going to make it worse and prolong the surgery. So he actually had an NG tube for a few weeks. And with the trauma of that and just the medication causing him to lose his appetite, he just became extremely orally averse and wouldn't take anything by mouth anymore. Um, so he got his G tube, and it ended up just being full feeds through the G tube. He still can, if he gets to a place where he accepts things in his mouth, he can do like purees and stuff. I probably won't do liquids anymore with him just because he can swallow, but I don't want to risk aspiration pneumonia. But he's on keto now anyway, so it's actually just easier to full feed through the tube, because it's not, I don't know, it doesn't look like it would taste that good to me. So for him, it just ended up working out so much better that it's just for full feeds and hydration. But knowing that in the future we can, adjust to how he's doing and maybe do half and half, or, pleasure feeds, or, just kind of whatever, and let him lead the way, rather than having to force feed and causing more trauma and that kind of stuff.
Thank y'all. Now, I know the next thing we're going to talk about is just the different types of feeds through the tube regarding like gravity, push, pump, bolus, etc. So if y'all just kind of want to elaborate on how that works for each of you.
So with Rob, we use the infinity pump, and he gets 4 feeds a day through the infinity pump. We use real food blends, which is pureed food, but we get it through insurance. Some people love it, some people don't. Everyone has their own things that they like to feed, whether it's home blends or formula, whatever works for your kid. We feed that, gets it 4 times a day, and we occasionally will syringe feed if we're like busy or the bag breaks or something, but we mainly rely on the pump.
I do a combination. So he has a keto formula, and then also I can do like keto blends, but it's just like baby food and stuff. So it's super easy. When I do his blends, it doesn't go through the pump very well, even if I do all the modifying and everything. So when I do his blends, I syringe feed. And then when he gets his formula, he gets it in the pump just because it's so much easier, and I can be hands free and get other stuff done. But all his water I push with a syringe. So I do kind of like just a combo. It just depends on the day and what he's having to eat. Before he started keto, I blended all his food, which is a labor of love, for sure. But he has a lot of food allergies, so it just worked better. Unfortunately, there's like no blended food, like prepackaged blended food that can cater to all his allergies. But when I blended, I solely just pushed with a syringe because it's too thick.
So for the most part, August only ever had pump feeds, and we used the Infinity as well. There was a few times where, for example, I had a spur of the moment, like family emergency type situation where I had to drive down to Texas, at which point the feeding pump decided it didn't want to be a feeding pump anymore. And there was no way I had called the DME to see if there was somebody, like if there was another DME down in Texas that could have brought me one. But ultimately I ended up having to do bolus feeds. There are the gravity feeds there the rest of that night and into the drive the next day and a half back. And so that was fun. And then I had later on when he switched from a G tube to a GJ tube, which he was getting 23-hour feeds throughout the day through his G tube or through his J tube. So I then had to do syringe feed where I slowly pushed the fraction of a milliliter through slowly throughout the day until I could get another feeding pump. But aside from that, he just did the regular machine feeds.
Okay. And we have talked a little bit about what are some of the different like types of feed. So I know y'all mentioned like blended food, prepackaged food, formula-based foods. So if someone just kind of wanted to go a little more detail about that.
Like I said, we use real food blends, which is just blended food, but it's prepackaged. You get it through insurance. I know there's like Nourish, which is another prepackaged blended food. People use Kate Farms, or I mean, there's some people just use Pediasure with a mix of other things. Really, we work with my son's nutritionist at the local children's hospital, and she helps us figure out like exactly how many calories he should get and how much water he should get every day based on his weight and his growth. And we use an app that they gave us through the hospital, and then I can input what he's taking in a day, and then so she sees it in his chart and then can say like, hey, we need to add more calories or back off. Or so we're really under the guidance of our local dietitian at the local children's hospital to help us figure out what works best for him.
So I exclusively pumped up until he was just till he got his GJ tube, which was just after he was a year old. So he got just my milk. I would do a little bit of fortification by adding like a fraction of formula to my breast milk. If he needed it, if he was lower on weight, just to help boost them up. But that was very, very rare. After that, we used Elecare and Elecare Junior once he reached 2, which was a hypoallergenic, like super broken down formula. So that way it would go through his intestines easier.
And then does anyone want to share about kind of the process with the DME company, like how that works, how you get the food, how often do you go through your nutritionist? Do you contact them directly?
So for us, when he first got his G tube, like when we were in the hospital, they would like the surgeon or whoever, because he didn't have a GI doctor until literally last month. But the surgeon would send the orders for all the supplies. So like the feed bags for the pump, syringes, like all that kind of stuff came from them. But then now his formula goes from his dietitian and neurologist. They write the orders for that because it's a very like specific amount that he needs based on the recipe or formula, like amount that the dietitian comes up with for his keto. So they then tell the neurologist and she writes it and sends it for the formula. So it's based on like his needs specifically. And I think usually that's how it's like kind of calculated based on how much they eat during like get fed during the day. And I know we get a little overage just in case because we have issues with our DME every once in a while, which is not uncommon. And then there's formula shortages and all that lately. So having a little bit extra is nice.
We the same thing. Our GI doctor sends the orders to the DME facility, which we use Quorum, which is a CVS facility, but there's different ones based on where you are. I'm sure, I assume there's some similar type system in the UK or other countries as well. It all goes through insurance for us. We get the feeding tube bags, we get the real food blends. We also have a stash that we have built up over time. And then we get feral bags, which is a bag to help vent the G tube overnight. We get the syringes, the extensions, and then for us in our insurance, we get a backup button every 4 months, but it's every 6. It all depends on your insurance. Sometimes I've heard even up to a year they will give one, but we get one every 4 months.
Or if you're really lucky and you have no idea why, you get one a month like we do. So I have a nice little stash of G tubes. But usually I don't know how we get one every month because according to like his insurance, it should be one every 3 months, which is I feel like the more standard practice. But I don't know.
I don't question it.
it.
Oh,
Nope.
Yeah, same for me. I actually called our DME more than I would say is normal. They would call me every month and, just like run down the checklist of, oh, what do you need? And call it doomsday prepping or whatever it may be, but I always said I needed everything. Just in case insurance didn't exist anymore or something. I was just really worried about not being able to have that access. So then I had a stockpile of it. I ultimately ended up donating all of that stuff. However, our DME was also the people that came out and gave him checkups after he was in the hospital or admitted to the hospital for one reason or the other. So I would, like, for example, like I said with Texas, I would call them and be like, hey, is there like a DME down here that I can get a feeding pump from? That DME also special ordered our GJ tubes because the hospital we went to had a GJ tube that he couldn't use. He had used it one time and he couldn't use it. He had a reaction. It was popping out all the time. We ended up trying for a second month, but then we ended up having to go with the AMT version of the GJ tube, which had to be special ordered and delivered to the hospital every time he needed it replaced because you need a procedure for the GJ tube.
Okay.
But the GJ tube, or the DME would also be the people that provided us the EleCare when we needed it, and they also provided us with the 1 can of formula a month that I used for supplementation that I mentioned before.
And if y'all would just talk a little bit about who manages the G tube. So which provider do you see and how that process goes and kind of follow-ups and that kind of thing, especially, when you're considering one or in the very beginning?
So for us, we're kind of like the wrong way to do things, I think, with our local children's hospital. But he never had a GI doctor until just recently. We switched to another hospital a little bit further away. And finally have a GI, but his surgeon, or so I thought, managed like his supplies, but it turns out it's some random pediatrician in the hospital that has never met my son. So we're just like kind of the wrong way to do it. I think generally, and Kat and Allison can probably go better into this, but I think usually the GI doctor manages more of that. And we have our second appointment coming up, and I think that's when like we'll go over that and hopefully switch to her managing the G tube stuff, because I don't understand why the surgeon a year later is still doing it. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, for us initially, when we were going through the whole process of the G tube and having it placed, the person that I talked to the most was the surgeon. The GI doctor I actually didn't meet until after he had the G tube placed. From there, we saw the GI doctor probably once every 6 months. We went to a main teaching hospital, and every specialty doctor that we saw was in the same office. So a lot of times, if I was there for, let's say, the pulmonologist, I could say, "Hey, could the GI nurse pop in for a second? I just have a question." And then she would run it up to the doctor, and eventually the doctor would either come in or he would give me a call. We also had a dietitian in that doctor's office that she ran, like she would come in and just like go over what he was getting. And the GI doctor was the one that would end up sending out for the prescription for the supplies. And then I would check in after that first 6 month checkup with the surgeon. The only time I went back to the surgeon was to have a consultation for strictly a J tube put in versus a GJ tube.
So for us, it is also the GI that kind of handles and manages the G tube care. But I just remembered as well that in the very beginning, when he got the G tube, they were going back and forth whether it was going to be under neuro's care or GI's care. And we ultimately decided on GI to manage it. And then we co-manage with the nutritionist, the dietitian nutritionist at the local children's hospital that works closely with the GI.
Okay, great. Next part of this, we just want to talk a little bit about just dealing with the stress of making a decision, dealing with the stress of navigating, the first months, the first feeds and all of that, the first appointments. So if y'all just want to share a little bit about that, what was most helpful to you in those days? What are some tips or tricks to helping you kind of navigate the schedule and getting, comfortable with the process?
I would say, so for us to like make the choice of him getting a G tube initially, there wasn't a second thought. And me and his dad had made an agreement. We both understood that I am an obsessive, like I just want to know everything. And by the time that the G tube surgery was offered, I had already done an extensive amount of research on HIE. I had ultimately found the Hope for HIE group or page and groups, and done a lot of like research. So it wasn't even a second thought. They were like, "You think about it." I looked at him and he was like, "What's your decision?" Because he knew I already had one. And I was like, "Schedule it." Because I knew that it would give him a better foot forward. I mean, he was only 3 weeks old, but at that point he was breathing on his own. He didn't need any other support other than anti-seizure medications. And if it was going to get him out of the hospital and home and working on therapies versus working on his his temperature in the hospital, I wanted to get him home. And so it wasn't even a second thought for the choice. Now figuring it out once he had the tube, I again did a bunch of research, but I also found G-tube groups or Tubey mom groups on Facebook, and I would go in, and any questions that I had, I was met with a bunch of support and advice. on the way that they dealt with it and got used to it. I actually ended up doing his first tube change at home on accident on Christmas morning. He pulled it out, and by that point I had become so comfortable with the tube that everybody was like freaking out, and they were like, "Oh no, he's gonna have to go to the hospital." And I just ran downstairs, cleaned my hands, got everything prepped and ready, and put the tube in, and he was good to go. At that point, he had been very clearly healed. So it's I would suggest just soaking up as much information as you can about tubes, and about how to deal with them and how to navigate maybe it's support groups and friends, meeting people that have also have tubies. I actually have a couple friends who have had tubies since then that I've been able to help.
I agree. Like I am a prepper and a researcher too, but since Logan got his kind of later compared to, some that get it in NICU or a few months in once the suck, swallow, breathe reflex integrates. For me, like a lot of the friends that I've made in this HIE community, their kids had G tubes for a year, 2 years, at that point. So I was able to ask them any questions I had, learn from them, just observing through like the internet. So that was helpful to me. I was very comfortable with it straight off the bat. And it was just like really not a second thought to me once I like realized he needed the G tube. And what kind of like helped me with that decision was one night when I was trying to give him his medicine, I was like, wow, it would be really nice if I could just give him like put an NG tube in just to give him his medicine. But then I was like, that's so stupid. Like that's what a G tube is for. And his feeding therapist, he wasn't in feeding therapy anymore, but I still kept in contact with her. She always told me that I would know if and when it was time. And I didn't really believe her, but sure enough, like I knew it was time. And she just reaffirmed that nobody was failing. He was not failing. I was not failing. Feeding is just hard and stressful sometimes for kids. And so having that like reassurance was really nice and made me feel more confident in the decision. And I don't regret it one bit. Not one single day in the last 13 months have I regretted it.
So, like Hope said as well, we got my son got his G tube at 14 months. So we went in for a swallow study and he failed all consistencies except for purees. So we were told we were staying the weekend because of course it was on a Friday. And he had an NG tube put in and we learned and managed the care for that and learned how to, check to make sure it was placed correctly and learned how to use the feeding pump and all the teaching stuff that goes into that. He had the NG tube for 2 months, I think it was. He did not tolerate it at all. He constantly vomited with it. And we were constantly at the hospital getting it replaced. So I called the GI doctor and said, I'm over this, schedule the surgery. I'm done. But I'll never forget that after the swallow study was done, I called a friend who I had met through a local kind of play group through Perkins School for the Blind. They have a infant toddler play group. And I called her because her daughter had a feeding tube. And I just remember crying hysterically, thinking I failed or he failed or why, just being an emotional mess. And she was like, Allison, nobody failed. He needs it. It's not a big deal. He could need it for a month. He could need it for a year. He could need it forever. You don't know. And it's okay to just need it for now. We'll learn it. We'll get through it. There's nothing you could have done differently. And she kind of talked me off the ledge. And then I embraced it. And now, I mean, really, it's the best thing ever. I think all kids it's such a lifesaver at times.
Thank you for sharing about that. The last thing I want to touch on just a little bit, I know that everyone here is based in the US, like on this panel, and we do provide worldwide services, but just to kind of give a little bit of information, if you want to share a little bit about navigating school, whether that's, early intervention or, elementary school or whatever set up in your area, just some general information about how you've navigated that or information that you wish somebody kind of would have talked with you about as you were starting to enter the school ages.
So for us, the feeding tube, for Rob's program, he goes to a like medically complex program at the public school. So for them, feeding tubes is just another thing that's they're super used to them. So it wasn't a big deal for us. The only thing that we had kind of ran into, because at one point I was blending all of his foods, but the school doesn't allow home blends in. It has to be pre-packaged. They have to because they classify it as a medication. So they have to be able to see the ingredients on it, which that's a whole nother day and argument, but it's, it is what it is. It's how we make school work, and it works for us. And we end up using the real food blends at home as well, because sometimes it's just easier than, sometimes we order out takeout instead of cooking our own meals. Sometimes it's just easier.
Logan's in school, but he just started this year 3K, and it's only a 3-hour program, so we haven't really navigated school feeding yet, but I do know it has to be put into his IEP. So when we do his new IEP in March, because next year he'll be going for 6 hours a day, it'll have to be put into there and figure it out from there. I'm not sure if some schools the nurse has to do it, some schools an aide can do it, some schools, like Allison said, it has to be in the package, which will be a real problem for Logan, because even when he takes his keto formula, it has to be mixed for the whole day because you have to add stuff to it. So all of that will have to be navigated. But I think it's really dependent on your IEP and your school's policy and procedure, unfortunately, like with everything else.
Yeah, at our school, the nurse has to administer it because, like I said, it's classified as a medication. So the nurse has to handle all of that.
So I don't have firsthand experience with school and stuff. However, August was starting to do programs at Maryland School of the Blind. And of course, while we were doing the whole process, he didn't get to actually officially start because COVID happened. But when I was going through and deciding if this was the choice that we wanted to go with, I asked, while he's here, who's gonna do the things that he needs? Now medication I didn't have to worry about except for the emergent need right now medication for seizures, but his other medication he would take in the morning. So really the only thing I had to worry about was his 24-hour feeds. And she had told me that, if I give them the information of when to change the bag or the formula and stuff like that, then the nurse again would do it. Yeah.
It's his school nurse that manages the G-tube feeds. He doesn't have a one-to-one nurse.
Yeah, he didn't have one either. We tried that. It just didn't work.
Well, I definitely want to save some time for the questions. So I'll kind of go over a little bit more information and then close out the recorded part of this session, because I know we've got some questions in the chat and I definitely want to make sure we have time. So one of the I want to make sure everyone knows is, please, if you have more questions, head over onto our Hope for HIE Facebook groups and our main parent hub. We have over 8,500 families from all across the globe, and you can always use the search feature to see, what's different questions and search for different questions, because there's tons of information there. That's the best place to ask a general question. We have groups for States, we have international groups. My information, my email is Haley, HALEY, at Hope for HIE. So please feel free to reach out to me anytime, or you can go to HIE.support. That's a place where you can get all kinds of information about just Hope for HIE in general and all the different supports we provide. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the recorded part of this, but I want to thank Kat, Allison, and Hope so much for sharing all their expertise and giving us a ton of great information. So thank you guys so much.